dust in Dr. Hale's office didn't so much float as it congealed. A visible, granular silt suspended in the cone of greenish light cast by his desk lamp. It was the kind of dust that smelled of decaying paper and the slow, metabolic breakdown of leather bindings, a scent that clung to the back of the throat like a forgotten word. Beyond the lamp's pool, shadows clung to shelves, overburdened with medical texts and case files, their spines a muted kaleidoscope of faded colors. An old wall clock ticked with the dry, arrhythmic cadence of a beetle tapping inside a wall. The room was a carefully curated tomb for other people's nightmares, and Evelyn Price was about to add hers to the collection. She entered, as if testing the temperature of water with a single toe, a hesitant shuffle, a flinch at the quiet click of the door closing behind her. Her scarf, a wretched thing the color of a bruised twilight, was clutched in her pale hands as if it were a lifeline or a garrote. She was thin in a way that suggested not fitness, but erosion, her edges worn down by some constant, internal weather. Her hair, a dark and unkempt cascade, framed a face that seemed all restless eyes, and the faint, silvered scar at the base of her throat, a punctuation mark on a sentence she never finished. Dr. Matthew Hale watched her from behind his desk, a man carved from muted tones and premature gray. His suit was the color of a damp November afternoon, his lean frame arranged in a posture of calibrated calm. He looked like a man who had learned patience, the way a geologist learns the language of stone, through immense, grinding pressure over time. His own office felt, to him, less like a sanctuary, and more like the bridge of a ship he was endlessly, quietly steering through a fog bank of human fracture. He gave her a moment to settle, to absorb the stale, disinfected air, to become just another specimen in the jar. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, even instrument, precisely tuned. It was neither warm nor cold. It was a tool. You can sit or stand, whatever makes you feel present. She chose the very edge of the chair opposite him, perching like a bird ready to startle into flight at the sound of a twig snapping 2 counties over. Her gaze skittered across the room, avoiding his, landing on a framed print of a bleak shoreline, then the grain of his desk, then her own trembling knees. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing, a third presence in the room, bloated and expectant. He let it sit. He was good at that. He could outwait silence itself, a skill honed through thousands of hours of listening to the spaces between words, where the real truths often huddled, shivering. Finally, her voice emerged, a thin, frayed wire of sound. "I didn't kill anyone." A pause long enough to hear the clock's inconsistent tick, tick, pause, tick. "I couldn't." It was a statement flung into the room like a challenge or a plea, a dialogue hook baited with pure, unvarnished terror. Hale noted the contradiction immediately, the declarative certainty of "I didn't," immediately undermined by the physical impossibility of "I couldn't." One spoke to fact, the other to identity. He steepled his fingers, a gesture he found vaguely ridiculous, but which seemed to put patients at ease, as if he were a cartoon version of a thoughtful academic. "Those are 2 different statements," he observed, his tone neutral, probing. "Which one feels more true to you today?" She flinched, her fingers worrying the scarf into a tighter knot. "They're the same thing." "Are they?" "One is about an event. The other is about the limits of your own nature. I'm more interested in the second." He leaned forward slightly, the chair creaking a soft complaint. "Tell me about the couldn't." And so she began, her words spilling out in a rushed, fractured torrent. She described the memory, or the absence of one, in splinters of sensation. The shocking cold of water, black and greedy. a scream that seemed to come from inside her own skull, layered over another, fainter one. The sensation of running, her lungs burning with an air that felt like shattered glass. Her narrative was a mosaic with half the tiles missing, a jumble of visceral impressions without context or chronology. She was a bystander, a witness, a camera knocked over during the crime, recording only blurred motion and jarred sound. Hale listened, his pen pausing over his notepad. He saw the contradictions not as lies, but as fault lines in her psyche. She spoke of the victim with a detached, clinical horror, but her own body remembered the event with the intimate, muscular panic of a participant. She was describing a ghost she'd seen from across a street, but her voice carried the rasp of someone who'd felt the ghost's breath on their neck. "You described the victim's struggle," he interjected softly, his voice cutting through her haze. "The water, the pleading, but your own memory is of running, of flight. A witness runs from something." "What were you running from, Evelyn?" Her eyes, wide and glassy, finally met his. "From it, from what was happening." Or, Hale suggested, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a scalpel seeking the precise point of incision. "Could it be that you were running from the part of yourself that was causing it to happen?" He let the question hang in the dust-mote air. "Couldn't, or wouldn't let yourself believe you could." The question landed not like a stone, but like a key turning in a lock deep inside her. Her face went blank, all the frantic energy draining away to leave a terrifying emptiness. The session, he sensed, was nearing its end. She was at her capacity, the walls of her endurance straining. She looked down at her hands, as if seeing them for the first time, these instruments that might be capable of anything. The clock ticked. The dust settled. The greenish light seemed to deepen. As she rose to leave, her movement was slow, weighted, as if the air in the room had turned to syrup. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and looked back at him. The fear in her eyes was no longer frantic. It was deep, still, and absolute. "If I remember," she whispered, the words barely audible, "will it destroy me?" She didn't wait for an answer. The door side shut behind her, leaving Hale alone in the silence. His pen hovered over his notepad. He did not write. The question echoed in the stale air, far more profound than she likely intended. The unspoken worry that lingered was not for her safety, but for what her memory would reveal. Not a single act of violence, but the terrifying architecture of a self that could accommodate it. The truth wouldn't destroy her. It would simply show her what she already was, and that, he knew, was a revelation from which some people never truly surface. His pen remained suspended, a verdict withheld. The silence in Evelyn's apartment had a texture, a thick, woolly blankness punctuated by the radiator's asthmatic hiss, a sound like a sleeping serpent lodged somewhere in the building's corroded innards. A single lamp with a frayed shade cast a jaundiced puddle of light onto a worn velvet couch, its springs sighing in defeat whenever a bus rumbled past on the wet street below. Through the slats of the blinds, the intermittent glow of a faulty streetlight pulsed, making the shadows on the scuffed walls stretch and contract like phantoms performing calisthenics. The air smelled of faint dust and the ghost of old meals, a stale perfume of solitude. This wasn't a home. It was a waiting room for a diagnosis she was too afraid to receive. Evelyn stood in the center of the room, a statue of indecision. Dr. Hale's question couldn't, or wouldn't let yourself believe you could, echoed in the hollows of her mind, a taunt wrapped in therapeutic calm. Her own reflection, a pale and fractured smudge in the dark window, seemed to watch her with detached curiosity. "What are you capable of?" it seemed to ask. The scarf was still in her hand, damp from her nervous grip. It felt less like fabric and more like a layer of shed skin. She needed to do something, anything, to prove she was still the curator of this space, not just its most haunted exhibit. Her eyes fell on the chipped kitchen table, on the small, battered shoebox pushed to one corner. A reliquary of a life she only half remembered. The box was a museum of inconsequence, a ticket stub from a film whose plot had evaporated, a smooth, gray stone from some forgotten beach, a cracked photograph of a woman who might have been a friend, smiling in sunlight that felt like it belonged to another geological era. Her fingers, clumsy and cold, sifted through these artifacts of a stranger. Then her fingertips brushed against cold, stamped metal. She froze. It felt wrong. Alien. She pinched it, lifting it into the lamplight. A brass arcade token, worn smooth at the edges, stamped with a cartoon star and the word BERTS. A jolt, sharp and electric, went through her, not a memory, but the shape of one, a negative space in her mind where something loud and bright and terrible should have been. A sound erupted in her head, a tinny, warbling jukebox tune, something with a manic, cheerful bass line that curdled into a dissonant shriek. For a fraction of a second, the two sounds, the cheerful tune and a raw, overlapping scream, were one and the same. A horrific chord played on the nerves of her inner ear. The token grew heavy in her hand, a cold, metallic leech. She stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. It was utterly unfamiliar, yet it felt as personal as a tooth pulled from her own jaw. Her voice, when it came, was a thin, bewildered whisper to the empty, shadow-draped room. "This doesn't belong to me, does it?" The radiator hissed its non-answer. The shadows stretched. The token sat in her palm, gleaming dully, a tiny, malevolent moon. Phone's ring was a shriek in the woolly silence, a sound so violently out of place that Evelyn jumped, sending the contents of the shoebox skittering across the table. She stared at the old corded phone on the wall, its black plastic body looking like a dead insect. It rang again, insistent, a mechanical panic. Who would call? It was never anyone. It was a wrong number, a solicitor, the landlord about the dripping faucet she'd reported in a fit of mundane courage 3 months ago. On the third ring, a thought, cold and clear. It's him. She picked up the receiver, her palm slick against the plastic. Evelyn. Dr. Hale's voice was there in her ear, calm, measured, a life raft in her sea of static. How did he get this number? She'd given it to him, of course, scribbled on a form. It felt like a violation, his voice invading this, her last bunker. She didn't speak. She held the token so tightly its stamped edges pressed into her skin. "You left abruptly," he said. Not a question, a observation. "I thought I might check in. I found something," she whispered, the words escaping before she could cage them. She described the token, the jukebox shriek that wasn't a sound but a feeling, a full-body flinch. She heard the faint scratch of his pen on paper down the line. The sound was infuriatingly clinical. He was taking notes on her disintegration. "An object can be a key, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and reasonable, which made it all the more unreasonable. "It can unlock a door you've kept closed, a very heavy door. I don't want to open it," she said, her voice tightening. "I want to throw it in the river. That would be fleeing, and we don't flee from the truth, do we?" There was a pause. She could almost see him in his greenlit office, steepling his fingers. "Hold on to the object. Don't flee it. Let it talk. Let it talk." The phrase was absurd, monstrous. It was a piece of metal. It didn't have a mouth. It didn't have a voice. But as his words hung in the air, the memory sensation of the jukebox tune and the scream threatened to well up again, a tinnitus of the soul. She wanted to tell him that some doors are closed for a reason, that some things inside are better left in the dark, rotting quietly. But she just nodded, a useless gesture he couldn't see. The phone call ended with his quiet encouragement, lingering like a scent. She was alone again, but not alone. The token was with her. She looked down at it, this small, cold brass circle. Let it talk. The absurdity of it curdled into a sudden, sharp anger. This thing, this inert piece of nothing, was causing this pain, this fear. She held it up, pinched between her thumb and forefinger, staring at it with a hatred so pure it was almost cleansing. Go on then, she thought, a dark, ironic challenge blooming in her mind. Say something. Tell me a joke. Recite a poem. Sing me that fucking song. She waited. The radiator hissed. A car alarm whooped faintly somewhere in the night. The token said nothing. It was just a piece of metal. Relief, warm and weak, started to trickle through her. It was nothing. Hale was wrong. It was just it slipped. A tiny, almost imperceptible relaxation of her tensed muscles. A microspasm in her finger. The token, slick from her nervous sweat, simply escaped its pinch. It fell. It didn't clatter. It made a soft, definitive tink as it hit the linoleum floor, a sound like a single drop of water falling into a vast, dark well. It spun twice, a wobbly brass planet, and came to rest near the leg of the table. She stared at it, the relief evaporating, replaced by a cold that started in her stomach and spread outwards. The silence it left behind was different now. It was a waiting silence, a hungry silence. The token wasn't talking. It was listening, and it had heard her. A whisper escaped her, so faint it was just the shape of breath against her lips, a confession to the darkness and the thing on the floor. It's talking too loud. The only thing more persistent than a ghost is a cold case file. It never haunts you with moans or chains, just with the relentless, papery whisper of everything you failed to prove. Detective Calloway stood before the caseboard, a giant pegboard of frustration, stained with coffee rings, and the ghost smudges of erased dry erase markers. The victim, a woman reduced to a nameless Polaroid and a few lines of clinical text, was a hole in the world, and the facts were like sawdust you try to pack into that hole. It never fits. It always spills. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a flat, monotonous dirge, bleaching all color from the room, from the faces of the few night shift detectives, from the very will to solve anything ever again. His workspace was a monument to practical despair. A metal desk buried under teetering stacks of old files, their corners softened into felt by time and grime. A computer monitor displaying a screensaver of endlessly folding pipes that seemed a perfect metaphor for bureaucratic hell. The air smelled of stale coffee, toner powder, and the faint, sweet-sour tang of takeout, food long since consumed and regretted. He picked up a red marker, its tip already going dry, and tapped it against the victim's photo. Time of death, estimated. Motive, unknown. Suspects, a list of pathetic maybes and one glaring, violent ex-boyfriend who was conveniently unaccounted for. It was all so tidy and so utterly useless. A younger officer, Denise Weller, approached with a fresh file in her hand, her posture so straight and efficient it made his own spine ache in sympathy. He placed the file on the one clear corner of his desk with a precise little thump. The keen file, sir. Full background. His alibi for the night is still his mother, who is, conveniently, nearly blind and thinks her son has the heart of a poet. Her tone was dry, impeccably professional, but he could see the slight tension around her eyes. She wanted this to be neat. She wanted Jonah Keene to be the one. Calloway grunted, not looking at the file. He'd seen it all before. Violent men were a dime a dozen, and their stories were as interchangeable as parts on an assembly line. Keene's a thug. He'd beat a woman for looking at him wrong. But this, he gestured with the dry marker at the crime scene photos, the riverbank, the reeds, the awful, intimate stillness of the place. This feels different, messier, softer in a rotten kind of way. Weller's brow furrowed. He had a sharp, analytical mind that liked to put things in boxes, and Calloway's intuitive mush was a constant irritant to her system. With all due respect, sir, the evidence we do have points to him. The neighbor's testimony about the fights, his history. The victim's sister said she was afraid of him. She crossed her arms, a gesture of defense. It's a pattern. It fits. Patterns are for quilts, not for people, Calloway muttered, finally turning to face her. He saw the ambition in her, the need to close something, anything. He'd been there once. Now he just felt the weight of all the open files, a library of unresolved sorrows. We follow evidence, not feelings, and we have no physical evidence putting Keene at that riverbank. Not a fiber, not a footprint. Then, why does her name keep circling back in the files? Weller's question was sharp, sudden, a needle jabbed into the bloated balloon of his skepticism. She wasn't even looking at him now. She was staring at the board, at a small, handwritten note in the corner, a name circled with a question mark. Evelyn Price, the witness, the one with the memory problems. Every time we hit a dead end, her statement pops up. Inconsistent, fragmented, but it's always there. Calloway sighed, a long, weary exhalation that carried the taste of old coffee and older regrets. Price is a crackpot, a trauma case, Hale's pet project. He said the psychiatrist's name like it was a mild obscenity. She says she saw something. She can't remember what. She says she heard something. She can't describe it. Her story changes if you look at it sideways. She's a black hole, a distraction. He wanted to erase her name from the board. It felt like a contaminant. A distraction from what? Weller pressed, her voice losing some of its professional polish, edged with a genuine, frustrated curiosity. If Keene is so obviously our guy, what exactly is she distracting us from? Her statements are all over the place, but they keep circling. Like a bird that can't find a place to land because the ground is covered in something it doesn't want to step in. Before Calloway could formulate a response that wasn't just a louder grunt, the main door to the precinct swung open, and a uniformed officer escorted a man inside. Jonah Keene. He looked exactly as his file suggested, gaunt, unshaven, with dark-rimmed eyes that held a perpetual, defensive glare. He moved with a wiry, coiled tension, like a spring loaded too tight. He was all sharp angles and resentful energy, a walking collection of bad decisions and worse luck. He was, in every conceivable way, the perfect suspect. Calloway watched him being led to an interview room, a shark smelling blood in the water. This was something he could understand. A man, a temper. History, this was solid ground. See, he said to Weller, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. That is a suspect, a person of interest, not a ghost story from a psychiatrist's couch. He picked up the Keene file, its weight a comfort in his hand. She's not a suspect. She's a distraction. He believed it. He had to believe it. It was the only way to keep the sawdust from spilling out completely. He turned away from the board, from the circling, unanswerable question of Evelyn Price, and focused on the solid, angry man in the interrogation room. He missed it entirely. The way the dim, fluorescent light from the precinct's grimy windows caught the glass of a framed precinct citation. creating a blurred, fleeting reflection. For a split second, the reflection wasn't of the cluttered room or his own weary face. It was of a woman, pale and thin, her image fractured and doubled, as if seen through a pane of cracked glass. A silent, haunting echo in the one place she supposedly didn't belong. Neon sign outside Bert's arcade sputtered a frantic, epileptic rhythm. A cracked tube of pink light spelling out ERTS in a dying scream. The B, having given up the ghost years ago and never been replaced. It cast a sickly, pulsating glow onto the wet sidewalk, a lurid beacon in the gathering dusk. The air out here was a greasy cocktail of ozone from faulty wiring, the ghost of cheap fried food, and the underlying melancholy of a place that time had forgotten to completely erase. Evelyn stood before the door, its glass smeared with ancient fingerprints, and felt the brass token in her pocket grow impossibly heavy, a cold, magnetic weight pulling her toward a past she'd bricked over. Pushing the door open was like breaking a seal on a tomb of forgotten noise. The inside was a sensory assault, a cacophony of decades-old machinery groaning through its death throes. The air was thick enough to chew, a haze of dust motes dancing in the weak light, carrying the smells of old cigarette smoke ingrained in the carpet, spilled soda fermenting in the corners, and the hot, metallic breath of overworked circuit boards. Flickering screens cast strobe-like flashes across the room, illuminating chipped cabinets housing pixelated ghosts and blocky aliens. The floor was tacky underfoot, each step a slight pull and release, as if the building itself was trying to hold on to her. Somewhere in the gloom, a jukebox sat silent, its bubble tubes dark, a sleeping dragon waiting for a coin. Evelyn moved through the aisles like a sleepwalker, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. The token felt like it was burning a hole through her jeans. This place was a museum of someone else's youth, a fossilized memory. And yet, every whirring sound, every garish flash of light, felt like a key scraping at a lock inside her skull. It was all so violently familiar, it made her nauseous. She wasn't remembering, she was reliving. Her body knew this place, even if her mind had exiled it. Behind a counter littered with spare parts and a dusty cash register, a man looked up. He was heavyset, with a wiry gray beard that seemed to be trying to escape his face, and a bald scalp gleaming under a grease-stained cap. His flannel shirt was a monument to past meals and mechanical struggles. He watched her with the calm, observant eyes of a man who had seen every kind of person wander into his decaying kingdom. This was Bert. He didn't need a name tag. The whole place was his name tag. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble that fit the environment perfectly, like the sound of a pinball plunger being pulled. Evelyn approached the counter, her hand closing around the token in her pocket. She pulled it out, laying it on the glass case that held a display of plastic prizes bleached by time. The cartoon star stared up. Is this from here?" Bert picked it up, his thick fingers surprisingly delicate. He turned it over, nodded once, a slow, ponderous motion. "Yep. That's one of mine. Older one, from the Star Machine. Jammed up solid, must be. 5 years back." He looked from the token to her face, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't just seeing her, he was comparing her to a file of faces in his mind. A strange, uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled only by the digital chirps and bloops of the arcade. "Funny thing," he said finally, his tone shifting from neutral to something more pointed, almost curious. "Haven't seen you in years." But you had that look then, too. He tapped his temple. Right here, like you were listening to a radio station nobody else could hear, all staticky and sad. The words landed like a physical blow. Years, he remembered her. The confirmation should have been a relief, an anchor in her drifting reality. Instead, it felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. She had a history here, a self that had existed in this smelly, loud, neon-drenched place. Self that was connected to the token, to the scream, to the water. Her mouth was dry. I used to come here. Sometimes, Bert said, his gaze unwavering, now fully engaged in the archaeology of her presence. Not often, always alone. You'd play that one. He jerked a thumb toward a dark corner where a hulking cabinet sat, its screen black. The old spaceship shooter. Star Racer. You were good at it, real focused, like you were shooting at something else entirely. He handed the token back to her. Then you just stopped. Figured you moved on, people do. She took the token back, its metal now warm from his hand. Star Racer. The name meant nothing. It was a blank. But the image, a dark cabinet, her hands on the controls, a focused intensity, it felt true. It felt like a memory of a memory. She was about to ask another question, to dig this hole deeper, when a sound cut through the electronic din. It was the jukebox. A coin must have been dropped into it by some unseen patron in the shadows. With a series of mechanical clunks and a low hum, it whirred to life. A record dropped. A needle scratched, found its groove. And then a tune began to warble out of the cracked speakers. A old, cheerful pop song with a jaunty bass line and a sugary sweet melody. It was the tune, the exact one from her head, the one that always curdled into a scream. The world didn't just tilt, it shattered. The cheerful music wasn't cheerful. It was a horror show. It was the soundtrack to a snuff film playing behind her eyes. The arcade lights flared and stuttered, not in the room, but in her mind. The smell of grease and ozone became the smell of the river, of wet earth, of something metallic and coppery. The sticky floor became muddy ground. And the face, the victim's face, which had always been a blurred smudge, a watercolor painting left in the rain, it surged forward from the darkness of her amnesia. It wasn't clear. It was still distorted, twisted in a plea, features swimming in and out of focus, as if seen through churning black water. But it was there, a mouth open in a silent scream that harmonized perfectly with the warbling jukebox tune. Her own voice came out, a choked, strangled thing that didn't sound like her at all. It was a statement of absolute, horrifying certainty. I was here. The memory didn't play out. It detonated. It was a bomb made of light and sound and feeling, the cold, the fear, the overwhelming surge of adrenaline, the taste of panic like a penny on the tongue. It was everything and nothing all at once, a flashbulb that left afterimages burned onto her retinas. And then it was gone, collapsing in on itself as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving her gasping, leaning against the sticky counter for support. The jukebox played on, mindlessly cheerful. Bert was staring at her, his folksy curiosity replaced by genuine alarm. Miss you all right? You look like you've seen a... But she wasn't listening. The shadows at the edges of the room, once just pockets of gloom, now seemed to writhe and flicker with a life of their own, pulsing in time with the frantic beating of her heart and the cruel, happy music. The memory was gone, but the terror it carried remained, a violent, electric current running through her veins. She had been here. She knew it in her bones, in her water, in the very core of her being. She had been here, and something terrible had happened, and the truth of it was still hiding in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the flickering neon light. Air in the forensics lab was so sterile it felt abrasive, a dry, metallic chill that scraped the back of the throat and carried the faint, astringent scent of isopropyl alcohol and the ghost of countless powdered latex gloves. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the relentless glare of overhead fluorescence, their surfaces littered with the silent, complex geometry of microscopes, spectrometers, and other instruments whose purposes were both precise and vaguely menacing. In a soundproof booth of thick glass, Rosa Delgado stood, her neat bun a dark, severe knot against the stark white of the lab coat, dusted with the faint gray residue of fingerprint powder. She watched, arms crossed, as her assistant, Kyle Ng, fussed with an audio console, his thin fingers dancing over sliders and knobs with a nervous, bird-like energy. "It's just ambient noise," Rosa said, her voice flat and weary through the intercom. She'd been at this for hours. Victim's phone, recovered from the riverbank, was a ruined thing, but its memory had held onto one final, desperate recording, a pocket dial of eternity, 23 seconds of muffled rustling, the wet suck of mud, and the distant, hollow moan of wind over water. "It's the wind, or water in the reeds. It's nothing." Kyle shook his head, not looking up from his screen where a waveform squiggled like a frantic cardiogram. "It's too rhythmic for reeds. Listen." He tapped a key. The awful, muffled sounds filled the booth, the wet struggle, the terrible, gasping breaths. Then he isolated a segment, looped it, and amplified it. Beneath the primary horror, a new layer emerged, a faint, almost subliminal vibration, a low, steady thrumming that was entirely separate from the natural sounds of the murder site. It was a sound that felt manufactured, biological, human. It's not noise. It's a hum, a vocal hum. See the pattern. He pointed to a regular, sinusoidal pulse in the waveform. That's not the wind. The wind is chaotic. This is melodic, almost. Rosa leaned closer, her skepticism a physical presence in the small booth. She'd seen 1,000 dead ends, 1,000 coincidences that looked like clues under the right, desperate light. This felt like another one. A trick of audio pareidolia, the mind seeking pattern in chaos, like seeing faces in wood grain. So someone was humming a tune while they were being murdered. Is that your theory? A last request for a lullaby. Her tone was sardonic, a defense against the absurdity of it. Maybe the other someone was humming, Kyle countered, his voice gaining a sliver of confidence. He was young, bright, and saw the world as a puzzle, waiting for his specific type of brilliance to solve it. He didn't have her jaded wait, her decades of seeing breakthroughs dissolve into nothing. The one not gasping for air, it's buried, subvocal, almost unconscious. He ran another filter, stripping away more of the high-frequency mess. The hum clarified, just for a second, a few wavering, off-key notes of a simple, familiar melody. It was there, undeniably, a chilling counterpoint to the violence it underscored. The debate that followed was a quiet war of worldviews. Rosa, the veteran, argued for coincidence, for the 1,000,000-to-1 chance that a distant car engine or a faulty piece of equipment had produced a sound that just happened to mimic a human hum at the exact moment a life was ending. She built her case on logic, on probability, on the clean, dismissive certainty she preferred. Kyle, the intern, argued from intuition, from the obsessive detail work of someone who believed every mystery had a solution if you just zoomed in enough. He saw the hum not as noise, but as a signature, a clue so bizarre it had to be meaningful. It's not a car, he insisted, his eyes wide behind his glasses. The frequency is all wrong, the resonance. It's coming from close to the microphone, from the event. He couldn't bring himself to say the murder. It's not noise. He looked at her, his youthful face earnest, completely missing the horrifying implication of what he was suggesting. It's her. The word hung in the processed air of the booth. Her, not the victim. The other one, the witness. The one with the fractured memory and the nervous hands. Evelyn Price. The hum on the recording wasn't a song of comfort. It was a sound of concentration, of dissociation. A mind retreating into a familiar, soothing pattern while the body did something unimaginable. The thought was so grotesque, it felt like a violation of physics. Rosa fell silent. She stared at the waveform, now clean and clear on the screen. The hum was a fact, a data point. It was measurable, quantifiable. It existed, and it tied the entirety of the violent, muddy struggle to a specific, hauntingly mundane human sound. Her rational world, built on hard evidence, now had to accommodate this utterly irrational psychological horror. She couldn't dismiss it. Her professionalism, her respect for the data, wouldn't allow it. But accepting, it felt like opening a door into a much darker, more confusing room than any murder scene she'd ever processed. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of every unsolved case she'd ever worked, she reached for evidence flagging form. Her movements were slow, reluctant. She filled it out with quick, efficient strokes. Case number, item number, a brief description. Anomalous audio frequency, possible vocalization by secondary party. She didn't write Evelyn's name. She didn't need to, they both knew. She attached the form to the file containing the cleaned audio clip. "I'll send it to Calloway," she said, her voice devoid of its earlier sarcasm, now just tired and flat. It's his call what to do with it. It was the right thing to do, the by-the-book thing, but it felt less like a revelation and more like the planting of a poisonous seed. The evidence was there, a digital ghost pointing a spectral finger, but it was evidence of something so psychologically fraught that she knew, with a sinking certainty, that the pragmatic detective Calloway would likely dismiss it as the audio equivalent of static. The truth was on a hard drive, but it was a truth no one was ready to hear. The smell hit her first, a cloying, sweet-rot scent that had less to do with forgotten garbage, and more with something fundamental giving up, a deep, molecular surrender that announced itself as stale cigarette smoke, cheap floral air freshener, and the faint, meaty decay of a life lived in slow, resentful decay. It was the smell of her childhood, bottled. Evelyn stood on the cracked concrete porch of her mother's house, a low, weary box of faded yellow siding, and felt 9 years old again, small and waiting for a shout from inside. The brass token was a cold, hard secret in her fist. She hadn't called. She just came. Some truths, she felt, shouldn't be announced. They should just arrive, like bad weather. The door swung open before she could knock. Marlene Price stood there, a cigarette dangling from her lips, its ash threatening to drop. She was thin in a wiry, used-up way, her skin like parchment stretched over sharp bones. Her eyes, the same shade of restless gray as Evelyn's, held no surprise, only a flat, weary recognition that bordered on annoyance. She took a drag, exhaled a plume of smoke that smelled like burning chemicals and regret. Well, look what the cat dragged in, and then forgot about for a year. Her voice was a rasp, worn down by thousands of such cigarettes and a lifetime of low-grade disappointment. "We need to talk," Evelyn said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy against her mother's gritty reality. Marlene gave a short, humorless bark of a laugh. "Do we? About what? The weather? My thrilling retirement plans?" But she stepped back, allowing Evelyn to enter the tomb. inside of the house was a museum of passive aggression. Faded doilies lay under layers of dust on every surface. A large, grim-faced porcelain clown stared from a corner shelf, its smile a painted-on threat. The air was thick and hot, the radiator knocking like a prisoner demanding to be let out. Ashtrays overflowed. Every object seemed to hold a grudge. Evelyn stood in the center of the living room, feeling the walls press in, each knick-knack a tiny judgment. "I've been remembering things," Evelyn began, the words feeling foolish the moment they left her mouth. How did you explain a fractured psyche to a woman who considered feelings a form of weakness? Marlene dropped into a worn armchair, its floral pattern bleached into obscurity by years of sunlight and neglect. "Remembering what? Your illustrious career, the parade of boyfriends." She took another drag. "Let me save you the time. There wasn't much to remember." "Not that." Evelyn's hand tightened around the token. "Older things from before. Things I did." Something shifted in Marlene's eyes. A flicker of something hard and knowing behind the curtain of smoke and bitterness. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by a sharper, more defensive scorn. "What things? You were a quiet kid when you weren't breaking things." She said it casually, as if mentioning a minor habit of leaving toys out. The words landed like a spark on dry tinder. "What? You heard me." Marlene waved her cigarette, tracing lazy patterns in the thick air. "Always so careful, so quiet." Then smash. A vase, a window, your father's ugly trophy. A cold, distant smile touched her lips. "Then you just stand there, crying like the world did it to you, like you hadn't been the one holding the rock." She shook her head, a gesture of pure, undiluted contempt. "You were always breaking things, then crying like the world did it to you." The air left Evelyn's lungs. It wasn't an accusation about the river, not directly. It was something worse. It was a key to a door she didn't know was inside her. A memory, not of the murder, but of herself. A self that could hold a rock. A self that could break things and disown the breaking. The token in her hand felt like it was melting, burning its way into her palm. Her mother's words weren't just criticism, they were a diagnosis. A prophecy from the past about the woman she would become. The argument that followed was less a conversation and more a demolition. Evelyn, desperate for an anchor, pressed about blackouts, about fugue states, about times she couldn't account for. Marlene, cornered and vicious, threw every shattered plate, every slammed door, every silent dinner back in her face. It was a familiar dance, but the music was different now. It was the discordant, screaming tune from the arcade, and it was playing in Evelyn's head. Her mother's bitterness wasn't just meanness, it was evidence, corroboration. Evelyn finally stumbled back out onto the porch, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that vibrated through her teeth. Fresh air, cold and clean, was a shock. She leaned against the peeling railing, gasping, her whole body trembling. The confrontation hadn't given her answers about the river. It had given her something far more terrifying, a context, a pattern of behavior written in broken porcelain and denied responsibility, a self that was capable. She looked down at her empty hands. The token was still inside, clutched in her fist, a cold, metallic heart. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper to the quiet, indifferent street, a statement of dawning, horrifying truth that was about so much more than one night by the water. "Maybe I've always been broken." She walked away from the house of rot, her steps slow and heavy, but her expression in the dim reflection of a passing car window was not one of shattered defeat. It was something colder, clearer. It was the grim, focused look of someone finally starting to recognize the shape of the monster, and realizing, with a sickening jolt, that the outline matches their own shadow perfectly. The truth wasn't emerging. It was assembling itself from the wreckage she'd left behind her whole life. Mind is a desperate curator, forever arranging and rearranging the museum of the self, hiding the ugly statues in back rooms and spotlighting the pleasant landscapes. But eventually, the lights fail, the doors swing open, and you're left standing in the dark with all the exhibits you tried so hard to forget. Evelyn stood at the edge of the riverbank, and the curator in her head had finally quit, leaving the exhibits to riot. Reeds whispered to each other, a dry, papery gossip about her presence, about all the presences this place had known. The air was a thick, wet cloth slapped against the face, heavy with the stink of stagnant water, of rotting vegetation, of something else underneath, something metallic and old, a scent that felt like a forgotten coin held under the tongue. This was the place, not a picture of it, not a story about it. The thing itself. The mud sucked at her shoes with a soft, hungry sound. The water, black and oily under the sliver of a moon, slapped against the rocks with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. In the distance, the dark hulk of a bridge loomed, its girders like the ribs of some enormous, dead animal. It was lonely here, eerie in a way that went beyond spook stories and into a deep, geological indifference. The world didn't care about her terror. It just was, and it remembered everything. She hadn't planned to come. The trip was a blur of bus transfers and walking, a somnambulist's pilgrimage guided by a dread that had become a physical compass in her gut. Now that she was here, every cell in her body screamed to run. This was the source of the poison. This was the wound. But running was what she had always done. Hale's voice echoed, not as a comfort, but as a challenge. Don't flee it. So she stood. And she waited. The silence was not silent at all. It was full of the water's slap, the reed's gossip, the thrum of her own blood in her ears. It was a waiting silence. It was waiting for her. Then the wind shifted. A slight gust coming off the water, and it carried with it a colder pocket of air, a specific concentration of that rot meat and metal smell. It was a key. It turned in the lock of her, and the door burst open. It wasn't a memory that unfolded. It was an avalanche, a cascade of sensory debris that buried her alive. Feel of cold, wet metal in her hand, not a token. Something heavier, longer, the weight of it both alien and terrifyingly familiar. The rough texture of wood, splintering. The victim's face, not blurred anymore, but shockingly clear, eyes wide with a disbelief that was somehow worse than fear. A blue scarf stark against skin gone pale as wax. A mouth forming a word, a name, maybe hers, but all that came out was a choked, guttural sound. Voice, not a scream yet, but a plea, raw and shredded, woven into the fabric of the night itself. Please don't. The shocking, brutal impact, a sensation that traveled up her own arm, a jarring vibration of bone and will. The sound it made was wet and final, a terrible punctuation. And then the running. Not from something, away from herself. The weight gone from her hand, left behind in the mud. The taste of copper and panic in her mouth. The world tilting, spinning, the stars smearing into meaningless lines overhead. The flashback didn't play out in order. It was all of it at once, a single, devastating chord of sensation, emotion, and absolute, unequivocal knowledge. It was the truth, not as a fact to be understood, but as a disease to be contracted. It flooded her, drowned her from the inside. She was there. She was both the person holding the weapon and the person watching herself do it. A dizzying, soul-shattering double exposure. She stumbled backward, away from the water's edge, her feet slipping in the mud. The sounds of the night, the reeds, the water, the distant traffic, faded into a high-pitched whine. The world had reduced itself to this one terrible, inescapable equation. There was no other person. There was no mysterious assailant. There was no witness. There was only the weapon, the plea, the impact, and her, the common denominator in all of it. Her breath came in ragged, sobbing gasps that tore at her throat. She wrapped her arms around herself, but there was no comfort to be found. The person who could be comforted was the person who hadn't known this. That person was gone, erased by the avalanche. The weight of it was physical, crushing her down onto her knees in the cold mud. The confession didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a biological inevitability, a truth so immense it had to be vomited out into the world to make room for anything else inside her. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper. It was a raw, broken thing, scraped from the very bottom of her soul and hurled into the uncaring night. It was a statement of fact, simple and absolute and horrifying. It wasn't someone else. It was me. The words hung in the air for a second, stark and naked. Then the dam broke completely. A scream ripped out of her, a long, agonized sound that held every shattered piece of her old self, every moment of denial, every phantom memory, every ounce of the guilt that was now her permanent atmosphere. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror, not at a monster under the bed, but at the monster in the mirror. The scream echoed over the whispering reeds, across the black water, and was swallowed by the vast, indifferent dark. It was a question, a condemnation, and a surrender, all in one. And the night offered no answer, just the echo, and then silence. The precinct's fluorescent lights hummed a flat, institutional note, bleaching the color from everything they touched: the scuffed linoleum floor, the weary faces of the night duty officers, the very hope out of the air. Evelyn stood just inside the buzzing entrance, her body trembling with a fine, constant vibration, as if her very molecules were trying to flee the truth she now carried. She was an exposed nerve, raw and screaming silently. She didn't walk to the front desk so much as she was delivered there by some final, desperate momentum, her shoes making a faint, sticky sound on the floor with each step. Her hands were empty. She had brought no purse, no coat. She had come only with the confession, a live thing writhing inside her, and the desperate, naive belief that its weight could be transferred, that someone else could hold it for a while. The desk sergeant, a man with a face like a closed fist and eyes that had seen too many midnight melodramas, looked up with an expression of profound boredom. Yeah, the word was a pebble dropped into the well of her terror. It took a moment for her to find her voice, and when she did, it was a cracked, broken thing. I need to speak to Detective Calloway. A pause, a ragged breath. It's about the riverbank case. The woman. The sergeant's boredom didn't shift. He picked up a phone, muttered a few words, his eyes never leaving her, assessing her not as a threat or a witness, but as a problem to be processed. He pointed a thick finger toward a row of hard plastic chairs bolted to the wall. Wait there. The minutes stretched, each one an eternity measured in the slow, grinding rotation of the ceiling fan and the distant, tinny chatter of a police radio. She sat on the edge of the chair, her posture a tight coil of agony. She could feel the eyes of the precinct on her, the curious glance of a passing officer, the blank stare of a man in cuffs across the room. She was the main exhibit in her own nightmare museum, and the doors were finally open to the public. Then he was there, Detective Calloway. He emerged from a hallway, his stocky frame moving with a tired authority, his weathered face a mask of pragmatic impatience. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked inconvenienced. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in the pockets of his worn suit jacket. "Miss Price, it's late." His voice was a gravelly rumble, devoid of warmth or curiosity. It was a tool for prying information, not for offering comfort. The confession tumbled out of her then, a torrent of broken phrases and choked sobs. She didn't offer a story. She offered the facts, stripped of all context, all self-pity. The weapon, the impact, the plea, the running, the truth. "It was me," she finished, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than her crying. "I did it. I killed her." She looked up at him, her eyes begging for what? Handcuffs, absolution, an end to the terrible, isolating weight of knowing. Calloway watched her, his expression unchanging. He let the silence hang after her words, a silence filled with the hum of the lights and the distant ringing of a telephone. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. He'd heard it all before, the crazies, the attention seekers, the guilt-ridden souls who wanted to attach themselves to a tragedy for a taste of its dark glamour. This was just another one, dressed up in therapist's office language, and a convincing performance of fragility. "Save it for your therapist," he said, his tone flat, final, dismissive. He turned to a younger officer, Weller, who had appeared at his shoulder, her face a careful blank. "Get her a cab. Or call that doctor she's always seeing. Hale." He said the name like it was a diagnosis. He turned back to Evelyn, his eyes cold and utterly certain. "You're not a suspect, Miss Price. You're a witness, a troubled one. Go home. Get some sleep." It was the most devastating thing he could have said. He wasn't rejecting her lie. He was rejecting her truth. He was telling her that her greatest horror was beneath his notice. Weller hesitated, her eyes flicking from Calloway's, retreating back to Evelyn's shattered face. A doubt, small but persistent, flickered in her professional demeanor. The files, the circling name, the strange overlaps. But Calloway was her superior. His word was the foundation of the world here. She touched Evelyn's elbow, her grip firm but not unkind. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's get you out of here." But they didn't put her in a cab. There was a procedure, a holding cell. Until Dr. Hale could be notified, until they could be sure she wasn't a danger to herself. It was bureaucracy's version of kindness, and it felt like the final, exquisite cruelty. The cell was a concrete box, a narrow bench bolted to the wall, steel bars that looked like they'd been cleaned with the same harsh chemical that scented the air, a smell of fake lemon and underlying vomit. An overhead light buzzed like an entrapped insect, casting a sickly, vibrating glare that eliminated all shadow, and with it, all hope of hiding. The door clanged shut with a sound of absolute finality. The lock engaged with a heavy, precise thunk. She was alone. The trembling stopped. The tears dried up. A strange, cold calm settled over her. This was it. This was the reward for her truth. Not punishment, but dismissal. Not justice, but a sterile, indifferent box. Weight inside her didn't lessen. It grew denser, more absolute. It was hers alone to carry forever. There was no transferring it. There was no sharing it. The world, in the form of Detective Calloway, had officially refused delivery. She sat on the hard bench, the cold of the concrete seeping through her clothes. She looked at her hands, these instruments that had held the weapon, that had clutched a scarf, that now lay empty in her lap. They were just hands. They belonged to a murderer nobody believed in. A faint, dry sound escaped her lips. It wasn't a sob. It was the ghost of a tune, a lullaby, something from the deep, foggy past before the breaking started. Her voice was a bare whisper, a thread of sound in the buzzing silence. Hush, little baby. The whisper hum faded. The buzzing light overhead continued its monotonous, indifferent song. The chemical smell lingered. The bars held. She was, and would always be, the only occupant of this particular hell. The truth was out, and it had changed absolutely nothing.